An EU-wide common tax code, an EU-wide common immigration policy, or even an EU-wide common army. In other words, a United States of Europe. Is this the future the EU is heading towards? To answer this, let's first have a more detailed look at the United States. Here the government operates on two levels, the federal government and state governments. Interestingly, both levels have their own structure, with each having a constitution, an executive, legislative, and judiciary branch. For example, on the federal level, there is the President, Congress, and Supreme Court. And on the state level, there are governors, state legislatures, and state courts. The federal government, based in Washington, D.C., handles national issues like defense, foreign policy, currency regulation, and interstate commerce for the whole of the US. State governments, on the other hand, like California or Texas, handle state issues such as education, public safety, healthcare, and infrastructure within their borders. Just think, controversial subjects like the death penalty, abortion rights, and even the rules for electing the US president can vary in all 50 states. For example, 27 states still officially retain the death penalty, although in 8 of these states, executions are currently suspended. The remaining 23 states have abolished the death penalty entirely. State governments are not subject to direct federal oversight when exercising their powers. Their authority is constitutionally guaranteed by the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution. Now let's take a look at a European country like France. Unlike the United States, France operates a unitary system rather than a federal one. In the unitary model, the constitution, along with the executive, legislative, and judiciary powers, are concentrated at the center or national level in Paris. All major power is centralized at the top, where you'll find the President, the National Assembly, and the Constitutional Council. This is where decisions on national issues like defense, foreign policy, education, infrastructure, and almost everything else are made. While France is divided into regions and departments, they have limited autonomy. Regions like Normandy or Provence manage local matters such as transportation and tourism, while departments handle responsibilities like social services and school maintenance. However, these authorities act largely as administrative arms of the state, with the final authority resting in Paris. France's unitary system is highly centralized, as the national government can grant or withdraw powers from regions and departments, with their authority not being constitutionally guaranteed. Now, if we take the French unitary model and the US federal model, and look at the spectrum from centralized to decentralized government systems, France's unitary system would be on the far left, while the US's federal system would be on the far right. One key takeaway here is that federalism does not mean centralization. Instead, it is a system where power is shared between levels of government, without everything being concentrated at the top. Globally, there are about 27 federal states and 166 unitary states, making the unitary model far more common. Interestingly, countries with larger populations tend to operate under federal systems. Well, except for China, which remains a unique outlier in maintaining a unitary structure despite its vast size. So what about the EU? Where does it sit on this spectrum? It's super complicated. In fact, we can't neatly place the EU on either side of the centralized to decentralized spectrum. The EU is far from a federal model, and even further from a unitary model. Rather, the EU operates as something called a supranational organization, sharing powers between its institutions and 27 member states. In some areas, like the customs union, competition rules, and monetary policy for Eurozone countries, the EU has exclusive authority. However, in areas of shared competence, such as internal market, environment, consumer protection, and transport, both the EU and national governments can legislate. Sectors like education, healthcare, industry, and defense remain largely at the national level, with member states also holding veto power in key areas, such as foreign policy, taxation, enlargement, and home affairs. So when we go back to our scale, the EU sits to the right of federalism, closer to something called a confederal model, where power resides primarily with the member states, and the central authority acts only if all the subnational governments unanimously agree. Currently, there are no true confederations in the world. A historical example is the political entity formed by the 13 colonies after the American War of Independence, which existed from 1781 to to 1789. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government had very limited powers. Each state retained its sovereignty and independence, with the central government only handling issues like foreign policy, war, and resolving disputes between the states. However, the central government had no authority to enforce laws, collect taxes, or regulate commerce. In some ways, the EU closely mirrors this model, with member states maintaining significant autonomy while working together on some common goals. This brings us to the next part. What's next for the EU? We essentially have three options: stay where we are, move right and return power to the member states, or move left towards a federation. Now, in theory, there's a fourth option. The EU could become a unitary centralized state like France. But let's be honest, no one really wants that, so we won't even entertain the idea. The easiest option is to stay where we are, but this comes with all kinds of problems. The EU is often seen as too complicated, too slow, and overly bureaucratic. It also suffers from democratic deficiencies and a lack of transparency. We actually made an entire video on this, so check it out if you want more detail. But in short, the EU in its current form isn't very effective at addressing major issues like defense, climate change, or migration. Another option is to return power to the member states, which comes with its own advantages, such as more direct control over national policies and less interference from Brussels. But what does the EU currently have power over that could actually move back to the member states? As from before, this graphic illustrates how power is divided between the EU and its member states. The first column lists the EU's exclusive competencies, where only the EU can legislate. The second covers shared competencies, where both the EU and member states can legislate. The third shows areas managed solely by member states. And the fourth lists areas where member states hold a veto. Some people advocate for returning to an economic union only. This would mean that the vast majority of competencies would shift away from the EU and back to the member states. In other words, the EU's influence will be limited to just a few areas, such as the internal market, customs union, and competition rules. There are advantages to this, such as more national sovereignty and the ability for countries to shape policies directly to their own needs. For example, countries would no longer have to adhere to strict environmental regulations or consumer protection laws that might interfere with business. However, there are also disadvantages, as this approach could isolate each country on the global stage. For example, can Sweden really tackle climate change alone? Can Latvia defend itself without any support? Or can Italy manage migration entirely by itself? That brings us to the third option, moving towards a federation. In a federation, there's a clear definition of which policy areas are managed by the EU and which are left to the member states. Let's revisit the EU competencies once again. In a federal model, you would expect more key policy areas to shift to the EU's exclusive competencies. For example, justice and home affairs, such as an EU equivalent of the FBI, foreign policy, a common military for defense, and EU enlargement could be managed at the federal EU level. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, could become a shared competency, meaning both the EU and member states would have the authority to levy taxes and manage budgets together. Meanwhile, other policy areas in which the EU is currently meddling, such as social policy or environment, could move back to the member states. Of course, there's an argument to be made for handling issues like climate change at the federal level, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments on how you would divide these responsibilities. Moving towards a federal model would also mean the end of veto power for individual member states. If a policy falls under the EU's authority, the EU would have the power to enact legislation without a single country blocking the way. Of course, European people would still have a say, but this would be through the European Parliament. In a true federation, the EU would also need a pan-European constituency. In most federations, citizens vote on both a local and national level. Currently, EU citizens vote for their national parties, which then form alliances in the European Parliament. With a pan-European constituency, citizens would also vote for EU parties, allowing candidates to represent the entire Union, not just their own country. This would foster a stronger sense of European identity and make the EU more democratic at its core. If you're interested in federalism, be sure to check out today's sponsor, the Union of European Federalists, who have contributed to the federalism part of this video. Founded in 1946, the Union of European Federalists have been steadfast advocates for the vision of a European federation. UEF is a cross-border, non-governmental political collective of dedicated individuals working towards a more integrated European Union. We encourage you to explore their work and perspectives on the future of the EU. You can find their details in the description below. Today, the EU is closer to a confederation than it is to a federation. But history has shown that a confederation often results in the establishment of a federation. Take Switzerland and the US. Both started as a confederation, but ended up becoming federal unions. The Swiss model is very interesting, as it has 7 heads of state, a direct democracy where the Swiss people also have the right to vote directly on specific issues, and the subnational states, also called cantons, have a lot of power. This might be the best federal model for the EU to adopt, but this is a topic for another video. So what should the EU do? Stay where it is, return power to the member states, or move left towards a federation? Let us know in the comments, and if you're curious about the weaknesses of staying where we are today, check out our video on why the EU is broken right here. Or if the idea of a federation interests you, we've also got a video on potential EU reforms here. Or if you'd like to discuss the topic further, then join our Discord. Link is in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and consider joining us on Patreon to support our work. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.